All right, everybody, we've made it to the final section, team roles, team development, and team training. I am going to probably get through this fairly quickly. And from there, you guys are just on your own finishing up the assignments and things. Okay, so let's talk about some additional considerations when it comes to teams. First, team member evaluation and feedback. So you want to always use feedback. We've talked about it time and time again. We've talked about performance measurement. So this is kind of that concept at a team level. You definitely want to use things that are objective and measurable. Remember, we talked about how production teams have easily measurable outcomes, so you can give them feedback on that. You also want them to be linked to the organization's mission. You might use team outputs, which we talked about, effectiveness, well-being, innovation, product quality metrics like those production team ones, like how much did they actually produce, or 360 feedback, which we've mentioned in the performance measurement chapter, where we talked about feedback that comes from all different members, supervisors, coworkers at the equal level, and even subordinates, even self, customers, clients, just getting feedback from a variety of sources. We also want to talk about team roles. So there's this big theory in IO called team role theory, which basically proposes that team effectiveness is what occurs when you contain a combination of individuals capable of working in 9 different team roles. And if you don't know anything about what I've been talking about with my choice for this week of Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring as my team, this team role theory kind of inspired me to use them because there are 9 members and this is the 9 team roles. This team role theory is often used by organizations to assess and develop teams. So you want the team members to fill these specific 9 roles. And I don't really need to go through them each one by one, but and you also don't need exactly 9 members on each team, but ideally you would have at least 1 person for each role, right? And in certain cases, maybe you need certain roles more than the others, but these are the important roles and they have, their pros and cons to them. And I spent way too much time assigning each member of our Fellowship of the Ring to one of these roles each. But I'll give you, for example, Gandalf is the coordinator. He's the mature, confident one. He identifies talent, he clarifies goals, and he delegates, which if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, is exactly what Gandalf does. He kind of sets the whole thing in motion, right? He goes and finds Bilbo and Frodo, and he makes them kind of go on this adventure. So, move forward from that. So the team role theory also specifically defines each different role with like one of 3 categories. They're either people focused, action focused, or thinking focused. And you can kind of see from this as well. And I threw in the names of the characters who fit each role. I should also mention that it's possible for an individual to fill more than 1 role. So you could have a smaller team and have 1 person filling 2 or 3 of the roles. But as long as there's someone to take part as each one of these roles. So moving on from there to team development. This Tuckman stages of team development is a 5-step or 5-stage process in how teams kind of are formed and developed. So step 1 is forming. The members become familiar with one another in the group, or the orientation stage. So this is what happens in that scene in Rivendell in The Lord of the Rings when they're trying to decide what they're going to do with the ring, and Frodo says, I will take the ring, and then you have that you will have my sword scene. I know I'm using an incredibly nerdy example, but that's how the Fellowship of the Ring is formed, and Elrond calls them the Fellowship of the Ring. Team development is stage 2, is in Tuckman's stages of team development 2 is storming. So we had forming and now we have storming, which is where everyone discusses their disagreement over procedures, their expression of dissatisfaction. You kind of just go through like, let's get it all out there and clear the air. And this also occurs in Lord of the Rings in that Rivendell scene. It kind of happens before the forming of the Fellowship, but I'll take it anyway. So this stage has a bit of conflict, but it's kind of like a brainstorming session. So remember, forming and storming. Stage 3 is norming, which is where you establish norms. So you kind of have a growth of cohesiveness and unity. You establish the roles, the standards and the relationships, and trust and communication start to build. So this kind of produces the structure. So remember, these are all the forming, storming, norming. Stage 4, performing. So that is when you just do the job, you do what the team needs. So goal achievement, task orientation, and emphasis on production and performance. So it's basically just doing the work. What were they set out to do? For the fellowship, it was to journey to Mordor and bring the ring. So they're on their way. And finally, the 5th stage is adjourning, which means the end of the team. You terminate the roles, you complete the task, they're no longer dependent on each other. It's the dissolution of the team. So you have, I selected 2 scenes from the movies. One is at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. The fellowship kind of falls apart even before the journey is done. But then I also included this picture from the very last movie where everything is actually done. So that is the 5 stages of development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And here's a little graph to show how it works, right? So at the beginning you form, when you storm you kind of have a dip in effectiveness, but then as you norm it increases rapidly, and at performance you should be at the top level of your effectiveness as a team. So let's talk briefly about a couple other things before we close. First of all, team training. One thing I definitely want to mention is cross-training. I believe it's come up in previous lectures as well, but it's just where you have every member of the team or multiple members of the team train in different positions. So they not only understand the duties of their teammates, but they can also maybe swap duties if they need to. And it helps give everyone a better idea of the broader team task, and also to appreciate each other more. And also just cross-training is good for skill development for everyone. It's also team leader training. So you want to maybe have specific training for the team specific leader. If there is one, there isn't always, but often there is. Hopefully to help them with all of those process elements we talked about, like team coordination, conflict management, and also cohesion. So team coordination training, similar, but for every team member to do, would be teaching the members about these elements of sharing information, managing conflict, solving problems, clarifying roles, and making decisions. So it's kind of like the leader training, but providing it for everyone to be able to all contribute to that aspect. So there is an overall effect of team training on team effectiveness, as long as you use the right types of training, of course. But a lot of the research in these areas is done in military contexts. In fact, a lot of team research is funded by the government or NASA, so either military or astronauts are very common areas that we're interested in when it comes to team research, but that's kind of surprising because teams exist in just about every industry. But we definitely need to do more research in order to find the same things in other areas of work. It's also important to consider cultural elements of teamwork, as we have considered in other areas. So while many people identify with their organizations, people who are in collectivist cultures, they derive more of their identity from the organization when it comes to their teamwork. Cultural differences also can lead to communication issues if you have people of different cultures, and this is something that I've seen NASA actually be particularly interested in recently. When I was working at the Institute for Simulation and Training, we were doing some studies on astronauts, specifically with cross-cultural elements, due to the fact that NASA, of course, wants to send a ship to Mars, and that ship to Mars will probably consist of people from at least 2, if not 3 different cultures, because no one nation basically can afford to get to Mars on their own. And so we see a likelihood that it will be Americans, Russians, and then possibly Chinese or Japanese astronauts working together. And that's pretty important that we understand how these cultural differences will matter in these teams, especially a team like that, because long distance space exploration, as they call it, requires these people to be stuck in close quarters with each other for a very long time. And especially with this Mars mission that they are hoping to do, it will be a couple of years that they're, together in a very, very small space. And it's also going to be difficult for them to communicate back with their bases on Earth because the distance to Mars is so great that there will be a communication delay. So that team quality is really important. There's also a number of other ways that team conflict can emerge in cultural differences. And those are things I talked about before when I talked about Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Do the people in certain cultures care more about long or short-term outcomes? Do they care about just power distance? Is that high or low? And do they have high or low uncertainty avoidance on top of the other ones we've talked about? So it's definitely things to consider when you're talking about building teams in this increasingly globalized society that we live in. That is all I have for you in teams. I encourage you guys to look into the research. I encourage you guys to think about questions you might have regarding teams and any of the topics that we've covered. But other than that, I'm done. That's it. We've completed all of our lectures. As I mentioned at the first video of these teams lectures, I am probably going to just exclude the org theory chapters. It just felt unnecessary at this point. So thank you guys if you watch these videos. I really appreciate you putting in the effort in this class despite the chaos of the times that we live in. I hope that you got something out of it, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help make this last couple of weeks of the semester easier for you. Okay, well, have a great one. It was great being your instructor for kind of half the semester and then a virtual instructor for the other half. Bye.